Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Clarence. Clarence is our Vice President of MBE Services for the minority business enterprises that are on the line. I'm excited to have you join us today. We began this series in 2016, where we really brought in candidates. At the time, there were many highly heated races taking place. And we wanted to make sure that not only did the lawmakers who were incumbents, but also those who are candidates hear directly from our constituency, but we wanted them to actually be able to share with you their platforms and what's important to them. We found this system has been a great series for us and very productive. We have continued to visit with our lawmakers and include not only state elections, but also national elections. And that brings us to our guest today, Senator Gary Peters. Senator Peters has worked with the council since he was elected back in 2014. And one of the things that I will share and thank him for personally is we run the Minority Business Development Agency as a council. I'll share a bit more about the council itself, but I want to highlight this point. The Minority Business Development Agency is a Department of Commerce agency, a very small agency compared to the SBA and the Economic Development Agency. And a couple of years ago, there was great concern over whether or not this agency would survive. So I traveled to Washington, D.C., along with about 20 other operators of Minority Business Development Agency centers. And we met with many lawmakers, but one of the first to sign a Dear Colleague letter and support the Minority Business Development Agency was Senator Gary Peters. So I wanted to highlight that as we start today, but I'll give you a bit of background about our organization. Then I want to give you some of his background as well and let him take I say the floor, but really the microphone as we're all learning in a new virtual world. But let me start with the organization. The Michigan Minority Supplier Development Organization is a 43-year-old 501c3 nonprofit. We are based in Detroit. We have offices in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Our mission and our primary purpose is to ensure economies are equalized so that everyone in a society can fully benefit and take part of the riches of what we consider this great country here in the U.S. At the end of the day, our role at the MMSDC is about bringing minority businesses, enterprises, and those range from anywhere from startups to multi-billion-dollar firms that we work with. In that 43-year history, we have continued to grow, and I'm proud to say our latest report from 2019 shows that we drive about $36 billion as minority business enterprises, just those we certify. By the way, not all minority business enterprises, but just those that we certify as a council drive $36 billion in economic impact and create and sustain more than 200,000 jobs. Our role in this economy is critical. Our voice is critical. And that's one of the reasons that you will hear us doing even more in terms of policy to ensure that those policies actually meet you at Main Street. After that, what I'd like to share with you is more about Senator Peters' background. He was elected in 2004, and he's honored to represent the state of Michigan in the U.S. Senate. In the 116th Congress, Gary serves on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, as well as Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. I tell you, with all of that committee participation, Senator, we're excited to have you at the helm. In the U.S. Senate, Gary's top priority is to continue supporting job creation and economic growth to strengthen Michigan small businesses and our middle class. He is committed to working with members of both parties to find common sense, practical, and bipartisan solutions to the challenges facing Michigan and our nation. Gary was born in Pontiac, Michigan, and is a product of Michigan schools. For more than 20 years, Gary has worked as an investment advisor, helping families save for their retirement and provide for their children's college education. He has always felt a need to serve, and give back to his community. We are excited to have him join us today. We will have a time of discussion with him where we'd just like for him to share the things that he's working on and the things that he sees in the future of our economy and within our great state. And then we will open it up for Q&A. Those of you that pre-submitted questions will have priority, and we will get through those questions, and we will try our best. If you will use the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen, simply type your question. You also have the ability through that Q&A box to vote on others' questions. So rather than type, if you'll scroll through and look for other questions, you may find that you think another question is more important, and you may vote to help us determine which ones are most important to answer today. This is a nonpartisan effort for us. We invite all candidates, and we do have other candidates slated. We'll share that at the end of the call. We have other candidates as well as our other incumbent senator that will be joining us very soon. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to you, Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And I still recall the meeting for the Development Center. I'm happy that has moved forward, and I'm also happy that in the CARES Act we were able to put additional money in as well to make sure that the incredible work that you do and that those centers do continues, particularly now during this challenging time, as we know that the impacts have been directed in so many ways towards communities of color, where we're seeing the impacts disproportionate by a considerable degree. And knowing that as I know that those small businesses and other businesses in those communities, if they don't survive this crisis, having that community come back will be a whole lot longer in coming forward, because those businesses are critical there, and it's difficult to think about a future if we lose small businesses all through those communities. So we have to lean in with everything that we have in order to make that happen. I just mentioned in the opening maybe some of the work, as you mentioned, the work that I'm doing related to COVID, and generally most of what I spend all day doing, and have been doing that for some time, is my work on the Homeland Security Committee. I'm the ranking Democrat. That means I'm the top Democrat on the committee. And in that role, we oversee FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency that has really the mandate to oversee the entire federal response to COVID-19. And it has been a very intense few months here, making sure that we get the personal protection equipment necessary, the testing supplies that we have to have, the critical drugs that are coming into our state. As we know, we've been a particular hotspot in Detroit in particular. And so as the crisis was unfolding, it was a day-to-day challenge to get the supplies just to take care of the hospital personnel who are on the front line, our doctors, our nurses, our medical techs. The supplies were not there. Unfortunately, the federal government did not respond quickly enough to this crisis, and we were in catch-up mode, and we continued to be in catch-up mode as a result of that. We're in a little better position when it comes to personal protection equipment now, but clearly we're going to need a whole lot more of that as we start opening our economy in a safe and responsible way. And in order to do it in a safe and responsible way, we want to make sure employees are protected, and we have to make sure customers are protected. And that means more protection equipment. It also means ramping up testing to a greater extent than we have right now. That has been ramping up, but when you think about people working in businesses all across the state, testing is a critical component of that. And in order to do that, you just need some basic supplies. It's not necessarily some of the problems with the lab capacity. It's there. Some of the limiting factors are things like cotton swabs. We don't have enough swabs to actually take the samples from people's noses. And part of that problem is that we only have one manufacturer in the United States that makes cotton swabs. We're almost totally dependent on this from suppliers outside of the United States. We've offshored so much of this business, particularly in critical medical supplies. Last year, I did a report as the ranking member of Homeland Security, because I saw this as really a national security, Homeland Security issue. I did a report that looked at the problems in the supply chain and the fact that we are so dependent on China, for example, for so many of our critical supplies. If you just think of drugs, life-saving drugs, the precursors, the chemicals that go into those drugs, over 80% come from China. And I wrote in the report, when there's a pandemic, and I said when because we know Pandemics have happened all through human history. They're going to continue to happen. We need to be prepared, and we need to learn lessons from this one so we're better prepared going forward. But when it happens, we're going to be in serious trouble. And little did I know, just a few months later, here we are in the pandemic, and it shows that we have to bring those supplies back. So I've been involved in a concerted effort to do that. I've got legislation for, first off, to know exactly where we stand. The thing that surprised me as we were working in the report is how little information the government had or anyone had as to what exactly is made in the United States, what's not made in the United States, how vulnerable are we? And when you get that data, it's going to show how vulnerable we are. And then we have to start incentivizing manufacturing here in America. We can do that manufacturing in Michigan. We can do it with American workers. We've got to take that back from China and other places. It's absolutely critical to do that. And I give the example from my work in the Armed Services Committee and as a former officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve and my military service. We know that we have to make sure we have military supply chain here in the United States should we go to war. And a clear example, and as someone in the Navy, I can tell you, we don't buy warships from China. We don't do that. We make sure we have shipyards in America that can build our Navy warships. When it comes to tanks and armored vehicles, we don't build those in China. We build them here in Michigan and in Ohio, and we have an incredible facility with TARDEC. We make sure we have that industrial base. And in my mind, that industrial base for military equipment is the same for any other critical supplies for the health and welfare of our citizens, and certainly medical supplies and drugs is in that category. So we have to take that back, and I've been working aggressively in that area going forward. Part of with the COVID response as well, there are a couple areas where we're dealing obviously with the public health crisis, and but it's also an economic crisis, as everybody on the call here or the Zoom fully appreciates as to what we're dealing with and the immensity of this problem. We have to deal with both simultaneously. Although I say first, as we do it simultaneously, we still have to make a priority of healthcare so that people feel safe, so they'll go out. As you're opening a business, you have to have customers that actually feel comfortable to go to your business, or it's difficult to survive. So we've got to be doing both. But when it comes to dealing with the economics, there were two main areas that I focused on. First off were families that were going to be immediately impacted and find themselves unemployed. And the numbers that we see are absolutely staggering in terms of the numbers. And we needed to make sure folks had the ability to put food on the table and keep a roof over their head. I actually wrote the Pandemic Assistance Act, which dealt with the expansion of unemployment. That's my bill. It was incorporated into the CARES Act. And what that does is it expands the number of people eligible for unemployment. So it's not just the traditional folks, it's also small business owners. If you're a small business owner, you can file for unemployment. If your business is suddenly dried up and you find yourself in a difficult situation, you can apply for unemployment. You think of all the gig workers and independent contractors. If you're an independent contractor, you can now get unemployment insurance. And that act was actually based on the work that I do with FEMA in my role. When we have very similar type of proposal or process, I should say, when we have a natural disaster like a hurricane. If a hurricane hits a region and people's jobs are literally blown away, we expand unemployment to make sure people can keep their families together. And so that was the model that I used. And basically what we have now is a hurricane that's gone across the entire country, and we should respond accordingly. There was also an increase in the amount of money that people could get per week by $600 a week through July. And I'll bring up one aspect for the business owners here that is really important, and that's the work-share program that's a part of it that I think gives great flexibility. I'd be happy to answer questions related to that later. But the work-share program says if you're an employer and you still need employees, but you don't need them for 40 hours, for example, they're a full-time employee, but the business clearly has been impacted as a result of the crisis. Let's say, for example, you may need them 20 hours a week. You pay them for the 20 hours a week that they're working for you, and they can still file for unemployment, get the difference, including the $600, and they can have a full-time wage, even though they're working for you for whatever number of hours you need them. That offers a great deal of flexibility, and you can bring people back as well. People who may be on unemployment now, if you offer a full-time job, they go off of unemployment, but if you only need them part-time, you can still bring them back. And it's a great program. We have it in Michigan, 20 plus other states have it. We're hoping to incentivize that across the country, and I can tell you business organizations across the state are utilizing this to a great extent. The other program, of course, is to keep small businesses in business through the 7A loan and the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP program, which was critical to pass. There is no question in my mind, if small businesses don't survive this crisis, it's going to be a long time before the economy can effectively recover. The engine of growth. The folks on this call today are the engine of growth. All of you are the job creators. You're the folks that grow our economy and create the economic opportunity for people. We have to do everything in our power to make sure you get through this crisis, get to the other side, and we can get back to whatever that new normal will be in the future. And part of that was to keep employees on the payroll as well. So you have your workforce intact and you're ready whenever you can open or get to more operations, you have it. And so I'm sure you're all aware of the PPP program, but I'll tell you my frustration with that, and it has been where I've been focusing a great deal of my effort, is that in my mind, some of the businesses that needed the money the most weren't getting it and still aren't getting it to the extent that they should get. What we saw in a program was that many banks put at the top of the list their best customers, the folks who had regular, strong banking relationships. They were at the front of the list. Everybody else was towards the back. And when the money ran out, those at the front of the list got the money and everybody else didn't. And we have to make sure that those businesses most impacted have the ability to get those resources. I have been asking actually for an investigation by the GAO to find out exactly how that money was distributed in that first tranche. We have oversight mechanisms in the CARES Act. Expanded IGs in terms of their authorities and resources, the General Accountability Organization. Actually, the accountability language in the CARES Act is what I wrote along with the Republican chair of the committee, Ron Johnson. Together, we came together. The government affairs part of that Homeland Security means we're the top oversight committee in the U.S. Senate. And we actually wrote the oversight package. And my Republican chair's credit, there was a lot of pushback from the administration to have oversight, but we came together in a bipartisan way in order to get that done. And now I've asked the GAO to take a look at how that money was distributed in that first tranche. And what is particularly troubling to me is if you look at just the numbers, here we are, Michigan. We are the 10th largest state in the country in terms of population, the 10th largest. And yet if you look at the money that actually went to Michigan, for small businesses, we rank 35 out of 50. That is simply unacceptable. We should be getting a fair share of what the money is going. We tried to correct some of that in the next tranche, and particularly for minority businesses and businesses in underserved areas, which were the ones that were left out. A small percentage of folks actually received it in those communities. And we think of underserved areas in our urban areas, as well as underserved areas in rural areas. Many businesses in rural areas weren't able to get it too because they didn't have those kinds of relationships. So we put in specific provisions to dedicate money to go to those institutions in underserved areas. So those are credit unions and community banks in those areas, as well as minority depository institutions that deal with minority businesses, as well as CDFIs. That money, though, went very, very quickly. And as we look at another bill, and I think we need another bill to continue to help small businesses, we need to obviously put more resources in to help those communities that have been impacted. And the African-American community clearly has been impacted. When a community represents 14% of the population of a state and yet represents over 40% of the deaths, we know we have to focus resources into those communities to make sure that they can get through this and get back on their feet. And there's a variety of things that we are doing and we must do that we're not doing right now that I've been pushing for to do. But that program hopefully will continue to refine that going forward. So with that, I think I want to make sure I'm giving plenty of time for folks to ask questions so we can have a discussion, and be happy to discuss anything that's on folks' minds or just hearing comments. I mean, a big part of what we're doing, and particularly as we're putting together the next piece of legislation, I need to hear from all of you. Corey Wolford is on my staff. I think she's with us here today representing me. Reach out to her. We need to hear your ideas, your suggestions of how we make this program work for us. You are all the experts. You're the ones on the front line. You're the ones fighting it out every day. Your businesses are absolutely vital to our economy. They're absolutely vital to the future of this country. The insights that you have and the suggestions you have are important. I will take those up, and I'll be your advocate in Washington, D.C. to make sure we can do everything we can just like making sure minority development agencies have the resources that they need. So I'll stop there and take questions.
So again, audience, if you would please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will include those. Senator, we do have some questions that were submitted prior to today's event by those who are registering. You've touched a bit on the Pandemic Assistance Act that you were a part of. You've talked a bit about PPP, and I know that's high on many people's minds. This first question, I think you've touched on it a bit, but I'd like to share, to your point, you hearing from constituents is important. So I'd like to share the kind of the backstory here, and then allow you to really address this person's angle, really talking about the financial services industry in particular. The question starts with this statement. It says, many companies have been challenged by the impact of COVID-19. We see many shuttering their doors, not able to withstand it, and others are restructuring their businesses and budgets to pay for the new normal in the office. This is thinning the bottom line even further, as you've just stated. As people return to work for the next 3 to 6 months, has any thought been given to the lag that has been created in getting new business contracts? As you can imagine, this will make receiving capital more difficult, amongst countless other things, and especially for minority businesses. Is the government working on any specific tools with banks now so that when we catch up to this lag into the fall and next year, the impact will be evident?
Well, the question is right on point, obviously, and I'm sure all of your members probably had a similar question to that, is about the timeline. And I think the one thing for sure is we look at the PPP program, which I'm sure the person who was asked that probably was part of that, is that right now the timeline is 8 weeks of that the forgiveness over that period. I think there's been, and I knew at the time and expressed at the time that that's going to likely be too short. We have no idea how long all this is going to last, clearly, but I think it's unfortunately probably going to last longer than any of us would like, as this virus is pretty persistent. And so it's going to be a while to recover. And eight weeks is simply too short. You know, even with when you look at the enhanced payments for unemployment, that goes through the end of July. That may end up having to be looked at as well. But if you look at the 8 weeks, we need to change that. There's an effort right now, an effort that I'm supporting as well, to expand the 8 weeks out for the forgiveness to 24 weeks. Actually, the House version that just passed last week or the week before goes out to 24 weeks. There's an effort right now in the Senate to move a 16-week, go from 8 weeks to 16 weeks to address that. But it's going to be part of the negotiations that we go through from both chambers to figure that out. It's also going to change some of the definitions as to how you use that money to give more flexibility to businesses. So particularly as it drags out and the fact that contracts aren't coming in is in the question, and restarting a business. We all know that it's not cheap to restart a business. It's not like you just turn a switch on and you just start right back up where you left off a few weeks ago or months ago. It's going to take resources. So that loan should have more flexibility. We also know that the cost of doing business will likely go up if you have to you'll want to provide personal protection equipment for your employees, make sure your customers are safe. There are all things that companies are going to need to do. And as we're seeing already with the very elaborate protocols by the auto suppliers and the OEMs related to that, there's cost. So how to use this money to cover some of those costs as well. So that's going to be a critical component. The other aspect that I've been working on, actually have introduced legislation called the Price Act that also makes sure that minority contractors get their fair share of contracts that are coming out from the government. As I'm sure folks on the Zoom here know, some agencies are a lot better than others, and some are quietly just terrible at it. We want to get everybody better at it. An example is actually Department of Homeland Security that has usually received recognition as one of the better agencies when it comes to having a very inclusive contracting policies in place. My legislation basically brings those best practices across the entire federal government, make sure that folks have a seat at the table to make sure the practices that we have demonstrated in some agencies that are good at it, those practices need to now be exported to other agencies all throughout the federal government. And my legislation basically moves that forward to make that happen, because government contracts are probably, for most of the folks here on the Zoom, that's not their total business. But it's a piece of it, but it's a great piece of business, because you know that that check comes in every month, and those bills are being paid, and it allows you to have a foundation for you to go after other businesses as well. But every federal agency has to step up their game and at least match some of the best performers that currently exist. And then once they do that, then we raise the bar even higher.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue to this next question. What is your plan to include veteran-owned businesses in particular? And we realize you are a veteran as well, Senator, but what's your plan to include these businesses in the supply chain purchasing process? For example, if 3% of the total federal spend was to be allocated to this cohort, this would provide a significant opportunity to grow and develop minority and veteran-owned firms.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the numbers are just so strong, which is why it's hard for me to understand how anybody pushes back on having these. There's a Michigan State University Professor Cook, some of you may know. She's actually done a study on this as an economist, that if you involve more minority businesses in the initial stages of development and of contracting, that you can actually see up to a 3% increase in GDP. I mean, it's an engine driver. It pays for itself. It spurs economic activity. That goes back to my work on the Joint Economic Committee, where we think big picture. How do we get the overall economy working? It's clear that this has been demonstrated, and there's a lot of support for that. So we do need to make sure that veteran-owned businesses, minority businesses are prioritized in contracts or have the goals. I've actually introduced legislation to do that. It's called the DRIVE Act, which gives a target across the federal government of 5% of contracts to disabled vets, and making sure that disabled vets have the opportunity, own businesses have the opportunity to get federal contracts as well. So it's always tough, which is why we have to do this. And people ask me, why are you doing it, putting these forward? I said, you have to move the ball. And there's already a problem in procurement in the federal government that drives me crazy, is that part of, in order to get a federal contract, usually you have to have experience with a federal contract. Well, that's hard if you've never had a federal contract and you want a federal contract. They'll say, well, you need to have experience to get one. You're basically shutting out everybody, because then you're only saying, those of you who we're doing business with now, we're going to keep doing business with, and we're not going to do business with new people. Well, that's unacceptable, and it's certainly bad business. And for the reasons I mentioned before, where you grow an economy, when you bring in new companies, new people, they're enthusiastic, they're excited, they bring an energy to the business, and then that energy creates more competition, and then other companies who have been lazy and figuring we've been having this contract forever, we've got it. They have to step up their game in order to keep the contract, and that's really a great thing. So bringing more competition in, opening up the process, particularly to minority businesses and veteran businesses, others that deserve to have a fair hearing and get their products across, will actually benefit the society as a whole. So it's something I feel very passionate about, and we're gonna keep fighting to increase it and get these bills passed.
Absolutely. The next question, Senator Peters, is can we have an update on the major defense initiatives out of the Ground Vehicle Systems Center, formerly TARDECT, and how you and your staff can help qualified minority suppliers become a part of that opportunity process?
Well, that's builds from this. The builds on the previous question too.
Right.
Is about bringing that innovation, because that's where you see the innovation. I mean, we're really blessed here in Michigan to have the Ground Vehicle Support Center in two areas. It's the next generation combat vehicle and the operationally manned vehicle are being designed and developed here. So the future of that U.S. Army vehicle is being born right here in Michigan. And there are a number of opportunities to be engaged in that. And my office engages regularly, perhaps with folks who are on the call right now, have worked with me to do that. So I would encourage folks who have projects and the ability to get contracts related to the development work of those two vehicles to contact my office. We're happy to work with you and to connect you with the right folks to make your case and and then get the contract going forward. So we're happy to assist, but that's kind of on an individualized basis. But I have strong working relationships with them. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, so I work with them on a regular basis. And actually, on the Armed Services Committee, I'm the ranking member, so I'm the top Democrat on a subcommittee within the Armed Services. And we have two areas of responsibility. One, I oversee, it's emerging threats and capabilities is the committee. And I oversee all of the nation's special operations forces. So think US Navy SEALs and Delta Force, folks of that nature. But we also oversee all the advanced research for the military. So the GVSE falls in that. That's the main research facility for the US Army. But I'm engaged in research for hypersonic missiles and artificial intelligence, autonomy, all of those areas. And so anybody who wants to have an opportunity to get into the advanced research for the military broadly, including aerospace and all of the other areas, we're happy to help in any way that we can. And that's directly related to the work I do as the top Democrat on the committee.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I am jumping around in these questions, trying to find segues to your last answer. And this one, I believe, is related. And then I want to shift gears a bit and talk a bit about exporting as well, because I think we have a good question about that. But the question that's a bit related to where we've been talking about innovative suppliers and looking at new technologies. This one is for Michigan-based minority suppliers that have initiatives and large investments in combustion engine technologies for better fuel economy and reduced emissions, enabling multiple fuel types, including biofuels and hybrid technologies. How can you and your staff continue to help promote this technology at the federal level with the EPA, the DOE, the Department of Defense, as well as internationally with global OEMs? This really revolves around DEP's engine ion sensor.
Yeah, and just generally across the board for greater fuel efficiency using the internal combustion engine. And certainly great strides have been made in improving fuel efficiency, but we know we can continue to do that. And a lot of that innovation happens here. And what I have found, and I'm sure I won't have anybody who will say otherwise here, is that most of the innovation happens with smaller companies. It's not the big OEMs, it's the mid-sized companies, the smaller companies that are able to come up with some very innovative solutions. But oftentimes those smaller companies and mid-sized companies don't have the research budgets or the R&D to fully develop those ideas for fuel efficiency and look at it as the question asks from a variety of angles, not picking winners and losers, because we should let the technology pick the winners and losers, whichever is the best technology. So we have to have grant programs that are not specific to this technology or that, but allow the American ingenuity to flourish. And I have a bill on that. I've been working on a bipartisan way. It's the Vehicle Innovation Act, and I'm happy to say that it's passed out of committee and now goes at some point to the full Senate floor. I'm working with Lamar Alexander. He's a Republican from Tennessee. We have working on a bipartisan way to reauthorize the grant programs for advanced vehicle research. And these are programs that will be over $1 billion going into advanced research and grant programs throughout the country to continue to focus. There's a lot of talk of electric and other kinds of things that are out there, but we need to, in the meantime, we've got to focus on the internal combustion engine, which is going to be with us for a long time. And it's the economics of that have just gotten stronger with the price of oil dropping as much as it has right now, but still squeeze out as much efficiency as we can in order to be good for the environment and good for the bottom line of folks who operate these vehicles. So the Vehicle Innovation Act will make sure we strengthen our ability to help small to medium-sized companies and develop this technology, invest in the technology, bring it so it's ready for game day, basically, and getting incorporated into to other vehicles. So that is something that hopefully will happen soon when we start focusing on other bills rather than just COVID bills. But right now, of course, the focus is COVID all the way of what we're trying to focus on to get through. But the fact that it's a part of a broader energy bill that's already passed out of committee, I'm very encouraged we'll be able to get it passed and get it over to the House, which should be very helpful to the individual who asked that question. That's an important question, one that I'm focused on a great deal.
Thank you. Thank you. Now shifting and talking a bit about exporting, you alluded to this a bit in your opening comments. What might export, or when might export restrictions be lifted for those companies that need to manufacture PPE and other vital supplies that we've all learned through this pandemic should be manufactured here in the U.S.?
So for companies to export them out of the United
Out
States,
of the U.S. to expand their customer base.
right. Part of that will be the Trump administration. They have not given any guidance as to that at this point. But I will say that a lot of that does depend on making sure we're meeting the needs here in this country right now, which are first and foremost to do that. So it kind of depends on what that item is. The personal protection equipment, mask, we still have probably insufficient masks. There still should be a huge market for that here for some time. But I'll tell you a part of that, and I've been pushing the administration to do this more than they have been willing to do, and that's the Defense Production Act. The Defense Production Act gives companies contracts, long-term, very good contracts to continue to make supplies that are necessary for America, because some companies are concerned if I start producing masks, for example, what happens if the demand dries up and I've made this large capital investment, and how am I going to recover that? That's what the Defense Production Act does. The Defense Production Act came out of the Korean War. And it basically, to deal with the war effort, the federal government can tell a company, you're going to make masks. It's not charity. You're going to get paid, and you're going to get paid well. And we'll buy every mask you make for a long period of time, because we know that we're going to need masks for a long time. And then when we don't need as many masks, we're still going to need a lot of masks, because we're going to have to restock the national stockpile. Clearly, the stockpile was inadequate to deal with the crisis that we had, particularly because the virus started to get out of control because of we didn't have enough aggressive actions up front that made it more difficult to try to contain it. So that's why that's why we have to make sure we restock that stockpile and put more in, because as I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately, we'll have other pandemics in the future that they occur all through history. And I also worry from my work on the Emerging Threats and Capability Subcommittee that I mentioned for the Armed Services. We also worry about bioterrorism. That's a very real threat, and we held a hearing on that last year as well. That has some real concerns. We have to be better prepared. There's going to be tremendous demand for these. There may be some areas where there'll be export for example, the ventilators. Ventilators production's up. Hopefully we'll be able to flatten the curve, and we won't have as many folks that need ventilators. And so as that opens up, then folks will be able to export those around the country. And I think we'll see that with all of those areas. But I think it's right now, the focus is still, how do we make sure we have enough of this for the needs here in America? But I want to make sure we're bringing more production. So that would mean more incentives as well for the writer of that question. Is that one of my pieces of legislation is to create manufacturing incentives for more companies to bring back production of all sorts of medical supplies that we need to have made in the United States. And I think that'll create a lot of business opportunities for a lot of folks here in Michigan.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to shift gears, so I do invite you to continue to ask your questions through our Q&A box. I'm going to shift to actually one of the live questions, and some of this, Senator, we know you're not directly responsible for, but we also know you often have access in your purview as a lawmaker to some of these answers. So we'd just like to know, do you have any updates regarding any COVID-19 vaccines that are being developed? Also, is there a possibility that the state of Michigan could be a part of a pilot COVID-19 vaccine program, given the impact of the virus in Detroit and southeastern Michigan?
Yes, there are a number of exciting projects for a vaccine that are going on right now. There are a number of vaccines that may be going into the next phase of their clinical trials within the next few months. So there is a lot. There's a huge focus on that. We've made major investments from Congress and the Senate, billions of dollars to aid this effort, working with American companies as well as Some companies in Europe, there's an announcement out for a big investment into Oxford University that's been moving along with a vaccine. In fact, they're building a vaccine off of a platform that they currently have to deal with the coronavirus. So it gives them, they know it's safe. It already deals with a different variation of this kind of virus. And so those efforts can continue. Some people are more optimistic than others, but most of the folks, the researchers, believe that towards the end of the year or early next year, before there's probably a virus or a vaccine ready to deal with the virus at that time. But certainly Michigan, to that point, Michigan, there's going to be a lot of clinical trials that are going to take large numbers of people that will be involved in those trials. And Michigan will definitely, I'm confident you're going to see Michigan as part of those efforts, given the fact of what we see. You're going to have clinical trials. People will be sought out in order to participate in those. We're already seeing some trials here in Michigan for some of the therapies. Beaumont Hospital, for example, is in a trial for a therapy right now. And I think as we talk about vaccines, probably one of the most promising areas, which would be earlier than a vaccine, will be therapies that can deal with the disease. So those folks who have the more severe illness, we can lower the fatality rate to be able to actually treat people. Right now, it's fairly limited as to what sort of therapies can be used. And those are usually a lot quicker than a vaccine. Vaccines take a lot longer. And I'll just put out to the folks too, if we're able to get a vaccine in 18 months, which has been from the beginning, I believe that will be the fastest in human history that a vaccine has ever been developed. So we all want to be optimistic. We all want to hope for the best, but we also have to be realistic about it. It could be some time. But I'll tell you, back to the supply chain, this relates to the vaccine, because once you have a vaccine, then you have a monumental problem of scale. How do you make billions of doses of that vaccine? In the United States, how do you make 320 million doses for everybody in our country and then across the world? And manufacturing that is not easy. In fact, Pfizer, though, has announced that probably at the front end, if their vaccine, if they're able to develop that, will actually be made in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So we may be a place where some of if they're able to make this vaccine, will happen here in our state. But we also have to think scaling. How do you manufacture that? I want to make sure it's manufactured in the United States. So that goes back to the manufacturing part. To do that, we can do it. But it's also just the supplies. It's not just the vaccine itself. And I've been leaning in on the administration on this, and is the fact that we've got to make sure we have things like needles and syringes and the little vials where you see the vaccine, the little glass vials, are really very sophisticated, and can you make 300 million of those? And if you can, but you better start doing it now. You can't wait till you have a vaccine and then have to start manufacturing. So we have to be doing a lot of things simultaneously to make sure we get a vaccine and we can get it out to the world. But obviously, 320 Americans are first and foremost on my mind.
Excellent. Another question, and again, we understand that you are our senator, but this is really a question that's about Michigan, but I'd like to just have you weigh in on your thoughts. The question is, will Michigan follow in the steps of the states like China in requesting employers to have employees report to work to the unemployment agency if they refuse to work due to COVID-19 concerns, to redetermine their eligibility for assistance? So does the question make sense?
Yeah, give it to me one more time.
Sounds like they have a couple of more words in there that are necessary. Will Michigan follow in the steps of states like Ohio in requesting employers to report those employees to the unemployment agency if they refuse to return to work due to COVID-19 concerns? This is, of course, to redetermine their eligibility for unemployment assistance if they refuse to report to work.
Yeah, if you refuse, I mean, and this is a state, the unemployment system. The unemployment is that if you're offered full-time employment, a job, you have to take it. So you'd have to be back on the job. So if someone refuses that's going to be up to the state unemployment office to determine whether or not there's eligibility for that individual. Based on the I don't want to give broad statement because it depends on the circumstances for that individual as they go forward. But that's part of unemployment. Unemployment is you seek work, although that's been relaxed right now because work clearly, it's not like you can go out and get hired very easily right now. That's not happening except in certain industries, grocery stores and other things, but it's more difficult to do that. But if your employer that you were employed by says, well, we now have a full-time job for you to come back, then you have to come back. And now if there are other options for people, if they are taking care of a sick person in their household, they can take family leave or things of that nature where they need to be there. And that's another provision of the federal law which expands federal leave and helps small businesses to be able to be reimbursed for offering family leave to a employee who may say, and again, this is on the individual case, I don't want to give out a blanket statement, but basically coming back saying, I can't go out. I can't go back to work because I have to take care of my child who's sick, for example.
Makes sense. I'm going to ask you a bit of an out-of-the-box question, and it's one with a bit of a historical perspective. But I'm confident that you, like all of us, learned about the WPA in school. And this question, Don, really looks back at that 1930s program that, as you know, put many laborers to work. So the question is, Senator, what's your take on the WPA? I believe it was originally titled the Works Progress Administration to really look at infrastructure and roads and bridges to help unskilled workers get back to work and have the ability. So when we think about our gig economy, it could be a solution. I believe if those of you that don't remember that from history, I believe it was finally and eventually termed the Works Progress Administration, or Administration. But Senator, is there a way that you can look at programs like that to possibly address what lies ahead for us to address the many wide range of issues from infrastructure to roads, bridges, and everything else?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And before I mention that, let me what occurred to me on the previous question: if someone refuses to come back to work, the SBA, if you're in the PPP program and you have to bring folks back, the SBA has already put out a directive that if someone refuses to come back, the business owner is not going to be penalized for that. You don't have to do that. So that should hopefully address some of the concerns that are out there. So because then that's not your fault. You tried to bring them back and they won't come back. You shouldn't be penalized for that. So now the question on the Works program, I think, and as you mentioned, it really was tied to the infrastructure investments. And I just think that, yes, we have to be focused on infrastructure. That infrastructure is going to be one. We know that it is an important investment for us to make, but as you're looking at trying to get an economy to recover, infrastructure investments help spur the economy. We've seen that time and time again. And there's no question we have to do a whole lot of that. And if anybody has any question about it, just think of what happened the last couple of days up in Midland with the dams that broke. These were old dams. They were in violation. So the federal government actually had them in violation that they weren't going to be able to withstand a severe storm. The company did not take those actions. And now we have over 10,000 people being displaced at a time we're in the middle of a pandemic. You can imagine having a absolute disaster fall on your family while we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a pretty horrible situation for folks. But unfortunately, we have an incredibly large number of dams all across Michigan that are not up to standard. They need to be fixed. You can't wait. And what we're seeing, when you look at the devastation, just watching the news pictures of the devastation, the cost of fixing those dams to make sure that they didn't break is so much less than the cleanup and the tragedy for all of those families. If you don't spend money up front, you end up spending a whole lot more money down the road. And what I actually did another report out of Homeland Security dealing with this from the government affairs perspective and the cost to taxpayers. And it said that if we don't deal with climate change, and what we're seeing with climate change is that we know the severity of storms will increase, as we've already seen, and the frequency of those storms will increase. So we're going to have a lot more of these kinds of events. And if our infrastructure is not up to snuff, we're going to continue to see failures from bridges to dams and just go down the list to do it. These are great jobs. We have to make sure, though, when we're doing these infrastructure investments in places like Detroit, that those are Detroit workers that are on that site, and that these go to local folks that can get the skills and the apprenticeship training. If they're entry level, they'll get more skills to allow them to move on to other jobs going forward. But we have to make those kinds of investments. I would hope, as we're thinking of COVID and how do we get to the other side, back to how we make sure small businesses survive, how we get to the other side, we're going to have to be making substantial investments anyways in infrastructure. Let's do it now. Interest rates are really low. This is the time to make those kinds of investments long term, put people to work, and actually save taxpayer money in the long run, because we will prevent the kinds of disasters like we saw up in the Midland area. The other part of infrastructure too, that I'll just briefly mention, I think is important, is broadband internet access. That's clear now with the pandemic. You and I are speaking on the internet, and if you don't have access to high-speed internet, this doesn't happen. And when you look at schools, if schools don't open this fall, and with children in urban areas and in rural areas, a third of the students don't have access to the kind of connectivity they need. That's something we have to address.
Right. Absolutely. And actually, you took my final segue question there. That was going to be my question about virtual communications and your thoughts on how we could expand that. So I'll add a final question here before we end, and then I'll allow you to make some remarks before I make our final announcements. And it's just a general question. What are you most proud of that you have accomplished representing the great state of Michigan?
Well, I'll mention a couple things. I mean, one, I was, as I was in the House, I was proud to be very active to make sure we actually saved the auto industry. During a time I was elected in 2008, came in 2009, an unbelievable financial crisis. And we needed to make sure that our auto companies and suppliers continued to function. This was not about Michigan. This was about the whole country, that you need to have a vibrant auto industry. And we came close to losing that. And if I would I'm going to say it loud and clear, thanks to President Obama and Joe Biden. I mean, they really stepped up when other folks around the country were saying, and I got this as a new member of Congress, I got this saying, well, why do we need cars made in the United States? You know, why is that important? It's like, because the job multiplier, the amount of economic activity is critical. I will always remember that really dark time when I first came in too, is that I met with the folks at Chrysler in Auburn Hills, because I represented that part of my congressional district at the time, and Mr. Nardelli, who was the CEO at the time. And I was up there with him and his board and folks. And he said to me, he said, Congressman, I want to be clear here. You know, the capital markets are frozen. We can't get money. So if we can't go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy because you need debtor in possession financing. We aren't going to get it. Because I think we're just a matter of a few weeks away of liquidating Chrysler, shutting the doors and just liquidating everything. And, you know, here I am at the Chrysler headquarters, as we all know, a massive building and the massive parking lots. And I just immediately had visions of grass growing in the parking lot and empty of cars, lives shattered. And that would have spilled over to all of our auto suppliers, all the folks here on the Zoom. It would, because then when they went, then that would jeopardize GM and Ford even more. It was a catastrophic situation. So and there was talk of not including Chrysler in that plan. And I was incredibly aggressive, talked directly to the president and made the case aggressively when worked with my colleagues and had that happen to save it. So when I look back, it was an important moment for me. And I'll just leave you one recent one that I feel that I think is very important. And that's standing up for veterans who are suffering from PTSD, but may not have been diagnosed while they're in service. And it came to me from a constituent in Grand Rapids, a Marine who was served honorably in Afghanistan, but when he came home, had some real issues as a result of the PTSD, but it wasn't diagnosed. So his behaviors changed, and long story short, it ended up for him being discharged from the military with a less than honorable discharge. He ended up homeless. He was homeless on the streets. He went to the VA, and the VA screened him, and they said, you know, the reason you're having this trouble is because you're suffering from PTSD, but because you have a bad paper discharge from the military, we can't help you. Well, that is absolutely outrageous that he could not get help. And it turns out we're talking about tens of thousands of people in that situation. So I worked on legislation got all the veterans groups together, built a coalition, and we've passed legislation now that says individuals like that, if they're suffering and they have credible medical evidence to show that it's a result of their service to the military and to our country, that they can get those bad papers changed and have an honorable discharge and get the treatment that they need and that they deserve. And so that homeless vet is no longer homeless. He's on the road to recovery. And we're talking about tens of thousands of other vets that were in that situation. And I just think it's so important that we stand up for those who are willing to go into harm's way to make sure that they get the treatment. So that's something I reflect on often.
Good. I think that's a great point to end on. We have one other question. We have 2 minutes, Senator. So this is going to be a rapid fire response, but I think it's a good one to end on. The pandemic has taught us a lot. What do you believe in terms of looking at ventilators and how Michigan, I know you're extremely proud of how Michigan came to the forefront and began to manufacture products that were needed. Is there a chance that Michigan can continue to produce ventilators, for example, even after the pandemic, and how can you help?
Yes, I do. And I think medical supplies generally, as we bring back critical medical supplies, take that back from foreign production. The one amazing thing that I love about Michigan is that we know how to make stuff here. We are manufacturers. We do it better than anywhere else in the world. All of the folks here are manufacturers. We know how to make things, precision manufacturing. And the beauty of knowing how to make things, and particularly precision manufacturing, is that you can make anything. We know we can build autos and auto parts, and those are very sophisticated. The types of tolerances involved in the manufacturing of autos are incredibly tight. You have to be precision. And that kind of precision manufacturing you need in medical devices. But we already do that. And if anyone had any question about it, just look at the amazing turnaround with General Motors and Ford and other suppliers that we're seeing around the state taking various aspects of it and are making it. You see that in the aerospace area. I've been working over the last few years to make sure that we're also a center for aerospace manufacturing here in Michigan. So this is an amazing opportunity for us. We need to seize it, but that's why we have to make a commitment from this country as well that we're going to take back production from overseas, particularly on life-saving equipment like medical supplies. We're going to make it in America. And when we make it in America, Michigan always does very well.
Absolutely. And I have to add a footnote. There's no one better than minority businesses to actually do that work. So I appreciate you joining us today, but I can only envision that the poverty corridor is no longer the poverty corridor if we can place in Detroit and Flint and some of these other depressed areas, manufacturing facilities owned by minority businesses, supported by the federal government and all of the private corporations. That's how we make this an economy that works for everyone. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all of you for joining us. We literally pulled this together in less than a week, so I also indulge me. I know we're a bit over time, but I thought that last question was a perfect one to end on. Because we have learned so many things from COVID-19 and we appreciate the many lawmakers. We have so many people that have assisted today, Bridget Daly, Dan Jackson from our team, as well as Corey Wofford, who the Senator mentioned from his office, and Tyrone Sanders from Public Affairs Associates, who is our lobbyist. My final note to you is that there is an announcement here simply for you to stay tuned. On June 8th, we have confirmed Senator Debbie Stabenow, who will actually join us as well for a conversation just like we've had with Senator Peters, and John James is also confirming his schedule as well. We have many friends here at the council. They're on both sides of the aisle, and I just simply thank you, Senator Peters, for taking the time today to talk to us and to share, but also to hear from our constituents. Everyone have a wonderful holiday weekend.